Welcome to the Growing Green Ventures podcast, where we hear stories from impact entrepreneurs across different sectors and domains, learning the real steps that they took to create a business with lasting impact. Now, today I get to speak with Matthew Hawthorne, a thought leader in the circular textile space. He's a co-founder of TerrApparel, a circular outerwear brand focused on closed-loop textiles, using 100% recycled fabrics, fluorocarbon-free waterproofing and wicking finishes as well. Now, Matt is the footprinting expert at Quantis, an environmental consultancy focusing on consumer-facing industries such as food and beverage, fashion, and cosmetics. Now, according to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, as of 2015, 73% of textiles produced end up in landfills or incinerated. Only 12% of them, of global textile use, goes through what is called a cascaded recycling process, which usually implies a downgrading or a recycling into a lower value good, as opposed to less than 1% of total global textiles that gets recycled directly into new textiles again. Now, many statistics show that these our clothing and apparel ends up in landfill within 12 months from the date of manufacturing, not just the date of sale. Now, there's a real need to address how we make, how we consume, and how we dispose of our apparel pieces at the end. In today's conversation, we dive into concepts around circular fashion, the role of sustainability consulting, the difference between circularity and sustainability, and the emotional journey to close down one's company, integrating reuse and repair into a business model, and so much more. Thanks so much for your time. Enjoy. Well, Matt, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. We're really excited to hear from you and your story and your background. Before we jump into this, I'd love for you to give everyone a little bit of an overview of where you come from, what's your background, both professionally and personally.
Yeah, thanks so much, and thanks for having me. So my name is Matt Hawthorne. I am currently a footprinting expert at Quantis, a pure play sustainability consulting firm, and I work specifically with our fashion and sporting goods clients. And before that, I'm a nerd at heart. I have a master's degree in environmental science and engineering and a bachelor's in engineering and management from Clarkson University, as well as entrepreneurial experience with outerwear specifically, which I know we'll dive into a little bit today. So my background has been always around putting numbers to things I see in everyday life. And always towards the goal of limiting my impact and others' impact on the environment. I am a granola crunchy outdoor guy at heart as well. And so, that's where my interest in sustainability was born from. And I'm sure that story will come across today as we talk.
Totally. No, it makes no sense. Matt calling from Vermont. He's the granola crunchy guy for sure. Matt, you're an expert in the field of circularity, specifically within textiles and fashion. I'd love to understand why clothing? Why did you focus on apparel? How does a crunchy guy from the outdoors move into the sort of the fashion space, so to speak?
Yeah, so it's a really embarrassing and dumb, like very cliche story that I tell, but it really was born out of moving into my freshman college dorm and having been an outdoor enthusiast for my entire childhood growing up, being very blessed and privileged to not only grow up spending time outside in Connecticut, but my family has had a place in Vermont where I'm staying now. I grew up skiing and hiking in Vermont my whole childhood. So naturally, I had accumulated a lot of outdoor clothing over my time. I've also been about the same size since I was in 8th grade. And so going into my freshman year dorms, I had accumulated about 5 years of clothing, that had wear and tear to it, but that, had a sentimental place in my heart for one reason or another. And silly me thought that I could show up to my dorm room and have the same closet space and all of that I had growing up at home. And naturally that wasn't true. And so when I was going through the stuff I had brought to school with me and seeing that most of it was sentimental to me, but they had holes in them or the zippers didn't work anymore. And there was just little defects that required me to purchase a new rain jacket or a new set ski pants or whatever for my actual intended use of that product. But I had kept the old version because I was like, oh, I'll wear it to class one day or whatever, like a couple times a year, just to justify holding on to it. I realized in that moment that there was a lack of systems built to really ensure that these products could be maintained and kept in circulation for as long as possible. And there were these like really key weak points in a lot of products. Like for ski pants, it's always around the ankles where the edges of your skis can catch on your ski pants. They always rip. And so you see over time now, and especially with like race ski pants and things like that, there's more durable fabric in those areas to help prolong durability. But things like that were still being in development, and I would say are not widespread enough to be consistent. And so I took a look at that and said, yes, there's opportunity for design to improve durability, but ultimately outerwear especially is built to be beaten on, and fabrics are not infinitely durable products. And so there has to be better systems in place to maintain those products, keep them in circulation. And if they can't be maintained anymore, there has to be a better collection method to ensure that, in the future we can recycle these materials and reuse them in new ways. So that was where my interest in circularity was born. And again, I was a freshman in college. By the time I had this real frustration, it was, of course, wintertime, because that's when I brought all my stuff up for skiing. Right. And so it was, I think, spring semester that I really just started going down this rabbit hole of, what's out there, what are the key challenges, why hasn't the industry done something about this to date? And that's where I happened upon the circularity ecosystem.
Okay, fair enough. Now, when you're at university, you were ideating on this issue and you were sort of learning and diving deeper into it. You started TerrApparel, correct? Would you mind telling the people a little bit about that business and how that idea started? And you're seeing these problems in textiles and in sustainability, and you're wanting to do something about it. Give us a little bit of what was going on through your mind during that time.
Yeah, so TerrApparel was born out of this idea, and it was a venture that was co-founded with a business partner of mine, Maura McGuire, and the real ethos of the company was born out of the story I just told, which is that there has to be a better system in place. We have to understand how we can do better at the end of life for outerwear. And so TerrApparel was started first with the end goal of improving textile to textile recycling and forming the idea of basically an without me knowing what EPRs were. So TerrApparel was born basically without me knowing what extended producer responsibility is. It was born out of the idea of, every product we create, we're going to hold ourselves responsible for taking it back and responsibly disposing of it. And, the more I learn now, there's certainly flaws in that approach. And ultimately, I think knowing what I know now, a decentralized system is certainly better. But at the time, that was really where we were coming from, is we wanted to make sure that we didn't leave it up to the consumer to figure out what to do with that product at the end of its life, that, they had an avenue to feel like, the responsibility is on us as TerrApparel to make sure it gets recycled or reused properly.
Now, you bring up a good point about the flaws within a sort of individual take-back system from a brand, right? Like one brand is taking back exclusively their products to fix or dispose of at the end of life, right? In theory, that's nice, but in practicality, there are some flaws. And one of those is, of course, the inability for a startup to actually execute on that, right? You make 500 pieces your first year, your first season, whatever. They go out into the season. I mean, if you're a sustainable brand, ideally, you're actually making something of quality that's going to last for a long time. And so it's not going to be the next season, the next two that everything's going to come back immediately. It's going to take a long time. And so, are you going to be in business in 4 or 5 years, 6, 7, 8 years, when something actually is like, you know what, I think I can turn this back? I mean, that in and of itself, that's one problem, right? So all to say about EPRs, what can you say before diving deeper into TerrApparel? What can you say would be a better approach to brand and retailers take back programs when it comes to their taking in their product and having the correct end of life solution at the end?
Yeah, I mean, I think the really important part is that the most uh, efficient system is the decentralized waste
Mhm.
system, and that is why our municipal solid waste and our recycling programs are all local, and collection happens at the household and is brought to a local facility. That's done for a reason. It's most efficient for cost, but it's also most efficient from an emission standpoint if we're looking specifically at climate change and things like that. And so I think ultimately, in a perfect world, we need to get to the same place with things like textile waste and circularity in that context as well.
Mhm.
And so how we do that is, I think, a challenge, but it ultimately comes from your local consignment store is a great way to do these sorts of things. Where it gets tricky is when we start looking at, okay, if it can't be reused or resold or repaired, and we need to actually recycle the material at the end of life, that's where it gets extremely tricky at the moment. And again, it starts at design. It starts with the ability to design for recyclability. It requires a lot of technology transformation at the moment as well to ensure that,
Mhm.
even if we have a monomaterial garment that comes back and trims are taken out and it is just fabric, is there actually the technology available to do that recycling at scale, whether it be
Mhm.
mechanical or chemical? So there are so many challenges to making it efficient, and I don't blame brands for saying that we're only going to take back our own products. That's where TerrApparel came from as well, and I think it is
So you,
fair
th-
economically
th-
speaking. But
no,
uh,
sorry, just to interrupt quickly. So you're saying that you were when you started TerrApparel and you had this sort of take back program, you guys were willing to take other products as well, or just yours?
So at the beginning, it was just ours, and then a couple of years in, we had the realization that the take back isn't just for recycling. It needs to be about more than that, and we looked to pivot to be in the repair and resale space as well. And actually, primarily, that was our goal, was to be in that business
Mhm.
all the way. But we understood that that required us, taking in multiple brands' products. The
Mhm.
challenge with that is in the resale and repair space, being a brand selling other brands' products with your own repair spin on it is very difficult from a legal standpoint, and there are challenges there.
Mhm.
And so that was where we ultimately hit a wall. Taking other brands' products back and recycling them, there's no problem with that because it's all going into the same feedstock, and no brand name is on the label coming out.
Mhm.
And so, you know, there are many challenges to having a take back program as a brand and saying we'll take everything back, um, unless your end goal is just we're going to take everything back and just recycle it. If you're trying to do any sorting for repair and resale or refurbishment, it gets really really tricky to do that as a brand.
Totally.
Consignment store model is a different approach, but if you are producing your own products, it can get really tricky as well.
Totally. No, that makes sense. Um, so when you were thinking about making this repair part of your business model, what were you like partnering with local tailors and seamstresses, or what was how did that
Yes,
work out from a practical standpoint?
skilled labor was our biggest challenge.
Sure.
There was an organization near us, about 20 miles away from where we were currently based, that had seamstresses and tailors available who were interested in supporting. And so that was a cool moment for us to realize that that was a possibility. But the challenge we ran into was they needed to know the volume that was coming in, and especially at such a small scale, there was a lot of volatility in our take back and what we were able to provide, and understanding what that was going to mean for them to hold time for us as part of their process, because they were, of course, doing a lot of other things as well.
Sure.
It made it tricky. It was either we did it on a product by product basis, which was extremely costly, or we had to commit to providing a certain amount of volume a week, and that was also impossible to do. Skilled labor was definitely one of the largest challenges. The other one was, securing, deciding from a design standpoint, are we going to go with a color matching process, or are we going to try and do like a unique design flair to it, which doesn't require color matching, but does require us to basically put our own design spin on other brands' products. And that's, again, where we started hitting legal challenges. If you try to do color matching, then you need to source a whole ton of different fabrics for all sorts of different brands. And you also still need some sort of approval or blessing. That's where like there are kind of approved repair shops all over the country for different brands, but they've chosen that route, right? And so we either had to choose that or go the design route, and again hit a roadblock of can we sell it if it still has a brand name on it that's not our own. So that was that was the other real challenge, I would say, with running it that way.
So you hit these roadblocks that are quite large in its own right. What did you end up doing? What was the decision after a certain point?
I mean, I would say that was the main reason why TerrApparel is no longer, and why we decided to shut down, was we went down this pivot, mainly because we didn't feel any joy in creating new products anymore. It wasn't why we got into the business. Ironically, we got in the business to reduce textile waste, and it felt like with the original business model, all we were doing was creating more. And it didn't feel like we were actually replacing demand for anything else. And so that's why we tried to pivot. And then when we hit the legal roadblocks, and it was just feeling like, I think with more investment and more time, we likely could have found a way. And certainly there are repair shops around the country that operate and do great business. It was at a time where, my business partner and I were still very much, going through school. I might've been in grad school at that point. But we were still very much, young entrepreneurs. And it was a crossroads where we decided we weren't sure if we were ready to go for another investment round for a new pivot, just to see what would happen when we already knew that these roadblocks were there. And that was just...
I want to put a pin in this because I do want to go back to this sort of journey of being an entrepreneur and being a student at the same time. But you hit on something that I think deserves critique, or rather deserves discussion, which is that there are so many these brands, particularly fashion and footwear, but let's just stick to fashion right now, fashion brands that tell a great story and with a good intention of sustainability, whether that be focusing on building product around recycled materials or upcycled materials or whatnot, or using waste materials as their feedstock. But at the end of the day, they are still creating new product, right? And they still are probably engaging in a globalized supply chain to an extent. And a lot of the times it could be maybe mixed materials, mixed fiber products and whatnot. But again, their storytelling, their branding, their concept is about sustainability, in quotation marks, whatever that may be, the broad, big topic of sustainability. It's a green brand. But at the end of the day, they're still making new products. What's your gut reaction to that as Matt Hawthorne, independent to your role as a circularity expert, but from like a consumer and as an individual perspective?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know that I feel strongly about other brands. I mean, I knew in my particular case, I felt strongly that I didn't want to continue down that path as a brand, as a smaller brand, to create products with this ethos. And I think that largely that's why I chose the consulting route after grad school, is I felt like rather than having my own small brand and trying to change a system as part of the system, it felt like I could maybe make more of a change on the consulting side, working with already established large brands to transition their ways of operating. So that was the personal decision I made. I think, there are certainly super cool brands out there doing interesting things, and ultimately, like, it's not, the onus isn't on the consumer to make a transition responsibly, but as a conscious consumer, I will try to put my money where it's best served. And so if that means going with a smaller brand that's out there doing something interesting, and the work that they're doing is genuine, and it actually is affecting change and reducing my personal impact, that's a decision I've made to do. I don't think that every brand is out there doing it perfectly, especially the small ones. They're limited in funding a lot of times. They have a sole focus, and there may be trade-offs that they're not really, aware of at their size and scale. But I think it's going to take a mixture of small brands pushing big brands, and big brands just looking at themselves to really make the future what we need it to be. So I don't necessarily fault other brands for being out there, the small ones doing their own thing. I think they certainly serve a purpose, and oftentimes, even if their footprint is small, socially they might have a large footprint. And so if they are doing things to challenge kind of the status quo of the industry, I think there's a value to that as well.
I just want to run a few questions by you, because I think these are parts of the equation that don't get enough. You're gonna have to talk about in general. You have this partner of yours. How did you meet her, and how did you guys form that relationship to the point where it's like, let's actually build a business together?
Yeah, it's another kind of silly college startup story. We both lived on the same floor freshman year, and I had the idea, and I knew that I wanted to be much more on the product development side. Business at that time was not my strong suit in terms of like the financials and building a supply chain and all of that. Like, I had no knowledge of that. I just knew what I wanted the product to look like, and what I wanted it to do, the attributes I wanted it to have, and the ethos of the company. And so I knew I couldn't do it alone. And so, Maura was someone who I knew was studying business and supply chain. And so, I offered it up to a few people all at once that were all just kind of hanging on the floor. And she immediately raised her hand that she was interested. And I think it was by happenstance, but over time, I think it was pretty clear that, it was a great fit. There was a lot of balance there between her and I. We didn't always see eye to eye, but I think that was what made the partnership stronger. We that's the story of TerrApparel, if nothing else, is just that we ran at 1,000 miles an hour, and just to see what would happen. And the early days, even before funding, when we were just trying to see what was feasible, I mean, we made hundreds of phone calls to different potential suppliers and got told no more times than I could admit. In terms of just, would they be willing to work with us? What were their minimum order quantities, things like that, just trying to see how small of a production run we could possibly make before we went out to get investment for it. And, she was along for that ride the whole way. And yeah, it was just, it was cool to have that sort of youthful energy when we did to really just see what we could make happen with as little resources as possible.
To that point, how did you fund this operation? Did you guys just put your own individual savings into it? You mentioned investors earlier. Can you elaborate on the sort of funding cycle that you guys went on?
Yeah, it was super small. And it's like, it's interesting because startups come in so many different sizes. And when you're in like a tech context, what we got invested in was like laughably small compared to what your like small tech startup might get. Sure. But we got an initial round of angel investment. We also received multiple grants through New York State, and we participated in multiple business plan competitions. So our investment was probably somewhere around $35 or $40,000 between business plan competitions, grants, and private investment.
Okay.
And so that funded 2 different production runs with 3 different products over the course of, I think, 3 years. We did those 3 products. So it
Cool.
was definitely not all at once, and I would say that you know, if we had done it again, would we have asked for more money? Probably. And it's interesting because the angel investor that we had, he was also a personal mentor of mine, and he was basically like, he was funny about it because he didn't really say that he was interested in investing when I had a conversation with him, but I was basically just, we had lunch one day, and I was just asking him, like, had this idea, thinking about, trying to figure out what investment looks like, any advice, because he's a classic management consultant.
Mm-hmm.
And he was basically like, whatever you think you need, double it. And he was like, you're the largest fault of every startup is they don't ask for enough money and they run out of money, and that's why they fail. And
Wow.
even with what we thought we needed and adding some buffer, we should have added more. And I think
Interesting.
we were constantly kind of operating in a cash strapped way. We went through supply chain challenges, like one supplier really screwed us over and fell off the face of the planet after they received $5,000 worth of fabric from us. And there was like other challenges, but those are things where if you're cash strapped, like, it ruins a business. But if
Mm-hmm.
you have enough buffer, you can eat that and still stay alive. And that's
Mm-hmm.
really what we didn't plan for, was those sorts of supply relationships going south, and some classic supply chain issues that happen to every business, that just as a 18, 19-year-old starting out, we weren't really in the know that those things happen all the time, as
Totally.
often as
Totally.
they do.
Plus, fashion brands or performance brands are always pretty cash intensive to start
Yeah,
out. This is not
exactly.
a,
It's a lot of
yeah,
money to build products, and
exactly, exactly.
you know,
How did
so.
this affect you? I mean, you're doing this also, simultaneously to actually being a student. How did that impact your academic life, and how did starting a company in college, how did that impact your
I
life?
was a workaholic. I had no boundaries between personal life and school and the business. I basically, like, everyone who knew anything about me, that was the first thing that they knew.
Gotcha.
I ended up moving to um, Potsdam, which is the town where Clarkson University is, and lived there year round, starting I think senior year, and operated it from there. Maura was local to the area, so she was there year round always. But
Hmm.
um, I would say that how I balanced it is I just didn't really do much outside of it,
Yeah.
and that, like, classic hustle mentality is very much out of me now.
Hmm.
But it was what I lived on at the time, and I think, how it affected my academic life is actually, it's why I stayed for grad school. So when I started TerrApparel, I was in undergrad as a freshman.
Hmm.
I ended up coming in with enough credits where I graduated undergrad early. But all of that is to say that TerrApparel existed for 4 years. 2 of the years I was in undergrad, and 2 of the years I was in grad school. And it was through the grad school process where we decided to make that pivot to repair and resale, based on all of the academic experience that I had learned. So I would say that academics fed my experience at TerrApparel, and my experience at TerrApparel fed my academic experience as well.
Okay.
And if I was to do it again, I wouldn't change anything about that, doing them both at the same time. It was
Hmm.
certainly took a lot out of me. I took most of the summer after closing TerrApparel and finishing grad school to recover
Hmm.
from those 4 years. But what I learned doing both at the same time, I wouldn't take back at all.
Totally. No, I mean, those moments in life are the things that teach you the most, both on a personal level and from a professional level. I think this idea of canceling a, not, I don't want to say canceling, but like quitting a business, deciding to stop the business, is a really unique part of the entrepreneur's journey that, again, doesn't get enough attention on it, because it's not necessarily glamorized. There's the connotation of failure to it, but that's just an integral part of long-term success. And as someone who's also started a clothing business and then had to shut it down with a partner as well, I know what those conversations are like. It's kind of like a breakup in a way
Yeah.
to some. Tell us about, was there a period of time when the ideas of maybe we should stop, maybe this actually isn't worth continuing on. We're both going to be successful in our own rights down the line, but like we should maybe stop this because of these legal barriers, because of these supply chain issues and whatnot. Tell us a little bit more about that time frame.
Yeah, I mean, there's a weird relationship with something you create that is not uh, animate. It's an inanimate object. It's a thing that just lives, in terms of the startup, and it's a weird relationship that you have where it's like you want to nurture it and grow it, but at the same time, it can be a very draining experience. And I think what happened, I can't speak for Mara, but I know what happened to me was it was about the same time that we had the supply chain challenges where our cut and sew supplier basically fell off the face of the planet right after they received all of our fabric for our rain jacket. And we were like, what the heck do we do now? And that was after all sorts of challenges that we had had with them on the previous run, because they had done our first products. We were going back to them with our second one. Turns out they were just in over their head, honestly, and they hadn't really done. They specialized in denim and in shirts and sweatshirts. They had never done like a technical rain jacket before, but they didn't tell that to us. And then they received the fabric and the designs and basically like just went dark. And so it was about that time where we had been fighting like to get things figured out on pricing and everything for months, and then that happened. That it was like, what are we doing here? And so that was what prompted the transition to the resale repair kind of pivot. But then when we started hitting the legal barriers with that, where we were like really excited about this, we were going to run a small pilot, and then we hear from our counsel that like it's gray area, and basically if you want to do this in anyone, like you could operate without anyone really finding out for a little bit, but as soon as they find out, like you got to be prepared to have that conversation with them, and know that there is potential that you can't operate anymore. And so when we hit that battle, it was like, okay, so like do we really want to sink a year and more funding into this thing that might get shut down in a year anyways? And so it was the combination of those two things that really led us to say, what are we doing? And it just happened to be at the same time that I was graduating from grad school. And I was engaged at the time, and had made the commitment to support my partner through her grad school process that she was about to undergo. And so it just, life was pointing me very much in a direction where it was like, I have learned so much from it. And I can never say enough about the education process that I went through owning it. But it was very clear that to keep pushing, to keep it alive, was when I was already so burnt out from all of these roadblocks that we had hit. I wasn't in love with my company anymore the way that I used to be. And that was really where it was very clear to me. And I was fortunate that, Maura felt similarly enough at the end in terms of feeling burnt out and things that, and not willing to really go through another funding round, that we decided together that we were going to end it. That I think was the easiest part of the process, was coming to an agreement with her. I think getting there personally was definitely very difficult for both of us.
Totally. No, there's a lot of emotions behind that as well. But I mean, especially with the promise to financially support your partner in this transitional period of life, I mean, that's also a big motive. And then now, Matt, you're in consulting. You are a circularity expert at a top tier consultancy. You saw that as an opportunity to sort of make a larger impact.
Yeah, I'm in a very unique position
Hmm.
where the work I do is very technical, and there's a lot of overlap with business and strategy. But my motivation for joining consulting is I am always one who wants a number to back my decision. That's why I went into environmental science and learned LCA,
Hmm.
and went down this path, was because with TerrApparel, I wanted to know the strategy that we were doing and what we wanted to do was actually the best possible way. And if it wasn't, how can we optimize to make it better for the
Hmm.
environment? That's why I learned LCA. That's why I got into this space. So I'm very fortunate that the work that I do is to hopefully educate brands on the things that they don't have the capacity or the resources to do themselves. I'm really hoping that I'm not grabbing a watch and telling them the time. And my goal is that, if that's what they're asking us to do, um, we can rephrase and work with them to, um, actually add value.
Hmm.
If what we're delivering to them, especially on circularity and the strategy of circularity, is something that they could hear at any conference, then we're not doing enough. Circularity is an extremely nuanced space, and it's
Hmm.
very easy to generalize things to say, oh, just work in resale and repair and work on textile recycling, and invest in those avenues and engage with your consumers to educate them about your take back program. You can repeat ad nauseum those kind of boxed lines to every brand, but
Hmm.
again, my goal is to optimize things based on their specific product mix, based on their identity, based on their relationship with their consumers, with their
Hmm.
customers. And so I think that that's where I can add value. Is there are very specific parameters and there are very specific aspects to each individual brand that will tailor their circular strategy.
Hmm.
And if we're not getting enough data from them to give them something tailored, then that is something that I am willing to be transparent with them about. And I think that that's what the duty of the consultant is, to say, um, you know, the value out is equal to the value in, and it does take investment from, um, brands to explore kind of, uh, specific strategies to them, and it requires them being willing to do something new, something different. um,
Hmm.
and I think that that's why I'm still excited to be in the consulting space, and why I still enjoy what I do, because I'm hoping that I can provide more detail than what's provided
Hmm.
in any circularity conference that's out there, because there
No,
are many. And I think for a brand who's starting out, those are great. But my goal is to go deeper and be much more specific.
that makes total sense. And just to clarify my point earlier, sustainability overall, circularity in particular, is maybe understood by few at that high level terminology, but the nuances and the depth of the subject isn't known a lot internally, and they have to search for that expertise outside, and that's where someone like you really fills in that need. I attend a lot of events where it's sustainability talks and things of that nature, and there's a lot of talking points, as we mentioned earlier, that go around. But speaking with you specifically over the last year or so, I've seen firsthand the complexity of circularity and how it isn't necessarily just textile to textile recycling, right? Like product to product recycling. What do you think is most misunderstood about the distinction between circularity and sustainability from companies and from the general public?
um, that's an interesting question. I would say the most nuanced misunderstanding is the connection between the two. uh, and so I guess what I mean by that is there is a general sentiment that circularity equals sustainability.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that is the most difficult thing to tease apart, because brands have this, and I'm again highly generalizing. I'm at a conference. Here's my box,
Sure,
check
sure.
box that I'm checking. But there's a general idea that we're doing circularity as a pilot. Where is it going to show up in my footprint? And the point that I always try to make is that it's not going to show up in an obvious way. It's not a category in the greenhouse gas protocol that's like, are you doing circularity? If so, it goes in category, 24 or whatever. I'm making up a category because it doesn't exist. Instead, it's going to show up over time with scale in non-obvious ways, because your purchased goods and services are going to go down because you're producing less goods, and instead you're repurposing and reselling those that are already out in circulation. Your transportation and distribution is likely going to go down because you're centralizing and nearshoring your transportation and distribution of goods, because it's a much more national or local level that circularity operates in compared to the global level that traditional linear production works in. And so, there are end of life is going to go down as well, because you're producing less goods that ultimately need an end of life. And so you're going to see it in non-obvious ways, but it takes, a scale of 20%, 30% of revenue being driven by circular business models before you actually see your footprint genuinely decrease. And as long as you're increasing growth on linear business models, whatever you do see as a decrease will actually be washed out. And so you could have 10% revenue by circular business models, but if you've grown an additional 10% in linear, you're going to be like, why is my footprint still going up? And I think that is the real challenge on circularity, is this misconception that we're just by doing it in general, we're going to see decreases in impacts. And at the same time, that any circular strategy, any circular business model is better than linear. That is not necessarily true. There's a lot of nuances around how are the products transported and collected, how are they cleaned, what are all the processes that go into that circular model. And I would say in general it's better, but if you're working still on a one-day shipping model or an extremely central approach where you only have one facility in the center of the US that collects nationally all of your products, you're going to run into less impact reduction than what you were expecting. And so that's another real challenge.
That's a really interesting point you bring up, Matt. What I'm thinking about when you're saying all this is the focus on like carbon tunnel vision, effectively, like only focus on reducing your carbon and greenhouse gas emissions numerically down, and potentially, and you tell me, Matt, if I'm off about this, but implementing new systems of take back programs, repair programs, X, Y, and Z, and basically building out new systems of operating could actually in the short term potentially even increase greenhouse gas emissions if they're scaling up a new entity. What do you say to people and to businesses and business operators whose heart is in the right place? They want to do something about the climate crisis generically. They think of circularity and they have this association of circularity equals sustainability. Yet in reality, these generic circular ideas that they want to implement aren't necessarily taking into account any of the other environmental impacts that are real, right? That actually make a difference in this world, rather than just exclusively carbon. What's your take on that? What would you say to someone like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a colleague of mine at Quantis who says this, but linear business models have been around for a very long time and have had decades, maybe even call it centuries, at least 150 years of like true industrialization to make it the most efficient process possible and completely optimized for what it's designed to do. We are trying to basically take that and do the same thing immediately with circularity, right? And I think that that's a very unrealistic expectation to have. However, you have to start somewhere. And with considerable investment and considerable iteration, the ability to be agile and the ability to be, or the willingness to iterate quickly, and having a science-based approach, there is a possibility that we get there. So I would say that it's really important to start more than anything else. You can't wait for the perfect system to be built by someone else before you start.
Mm-hmm.
But you also have to be willing to change. You can't say that this is our take back program strategy and this is what we're doing for the next 10 years,
Mm-hmm.
right? There has to be a willingness with circularity to iterate as everyone is learning, and try as quickly as you can to learn from the mistakes of yourself and of others. And
Mm-hmm.
again, use data, use science, use LCA principles to help you optimize, and do so as quickly as you can, like I said.
Mm-hmm. Should there be a shared goal for what the fashion industry and the textile industry gets to, i.e., staying within this 1.5 Celsius degree scenario that we want to stay within, right? Is the goal, is there a singular goal that the fashion industry should be collectively working towards, and how would you define that goal if it exists?
It's a good question. I would say that, I mean, the goal is, of course, to operate within planetary boundaries. That should be the shared goal.
Mm-hmm.
I think what operationally every brand should sign on to in order to get there, um, is tricky. I mean, I think regulations are a great mechanism to do that. But I think that, as we're seeing in the European Union with all of the regulations that are coming up to get everyone within planetary boundaries, it's still extremely messy and it's still very unclear how businesses are going to actually comply with those regulations, given the gaps in data, and given the gaps in understanding what's happening upstream in their supply chain. So, I would emphasize that operating within planetary boundaries is first and foremost the priority, and should be the
Mm-hmm.
priority of the fashion industry. We know generally that to do that, uh, overproduction needs to be reduced.
Mm-hmm.
Circularity is a great mechanism to help optimize the use of resources that are already in circulation and of new resources that get used on an annual basis.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but beyond that, it does look slightly different for every company on how exactly they go about that. So, and that's where I think regulations stop and business strategy begins. Is you can have an EPI out there, you can have these other regulations out there to put the responsibility on businesses, but ultimately, businesses need to have a sustainable strategy for how they operate within that compliance mindset, while also doing everything they can.
What type of policy would you like to see enacted by specifically the U.S. government, either at a state level or at a federal level, to enable more circular business models to exist within the fashion and textile space?
It's a great question. I don't even remotely pretend to be a policy expert,
Mm-hmm.
and there are others who are much more equipped and knowledgeable in that space on also like what's currently happening, and maybe have a more educated opinion on what should be happening. I would say that even where regulations are being put in place, the organizations we work with are constantly scrambling uh, to try and get the level of data required to comply, because right now it's about visibility right now more than anything. They don't even really know what to change
Mm-hmm.
at the moment, because they don't have visibility into it. And so I think that, even before policy, investment in data, and traceability is really key. And I think regulations and policy that relates to traceability can be a very powerful first step um, to circularity, both upstream and downstream,
Mm-hmm.
and ensuring that what companies are saying is happening from a sourcing perspective. Being able to validate that, I think, is a great first step. But beyond that, yeah, it's kind of beyond my purview.
Totally fair. What do you think citizens should do to reduce their environmental impact through their use of clothes, apparel, textiles, and the like?
The biggest thing is, whatever you own, use until you can't anymore, use until it falls
Mm-hmm.
apart. And if you need to buy something new, that you're doing it in as responsible a way as possible. Buy timeless, really purchase products that don't go out of style. I think that's the biggest thing is, taking pride in what you own and what you purchase, and buying less for an occasion and more for a purpose, I would say, are the biggest ways. And of course, there are going to be exceptions to that, but the more that you can institute that when you go out and choose to spend your hard-earned dollars, the better off the planet will be.
I love hearing about this, and for those that are listening, I've learned so much about circularity and sustainable business models within the fashion industry, specifically through working with Matt and just having Matt as a friend over the last year. Matt, I want to know from you, man, what does success look like for you, both personally and professionally, in the next 5 to 10 years?
I would say that the goal is really to help, again, educate around the nuances with circularity. If we can get to a point where every brand is super clear, like it should be in the next 5 to 10 years, if I can help the industry be super clear, that I am a X type of brand, so I need to operate in these business channels or these operating channels, and this is how we would go about operationalizing that. Like, mm-hmm. I want the circular business model to be as obvious of a thing to implement as a linear one is. I think that would be a really, really great place to be. Like, if I don't have to be consulting on, let me put it this way. So I think the goal is that what I do now with the nuance of circularity becomes taking the watch and telling them what the time is. Like, I want that to be where I'm at in 10 years. That yeah. What I'm talking about now is just obvious to everyone, and we get to go deeper and be in a different spot where we're really looking at, getting from 5% of revenue to like true profitability, and it's 40% of a brand's identity and revenue is circularity. Like, if we're there in 10 years, I'll be very happy. It's a huge hill to climb to get there, and I'm setting a very lofty and likely unrealistic goal. But I think that, the more brands I can interact with, and the more the whole industry builds together, I think we're going to get there. We've already learned a lot in the last 4 years, or even 6 or 7 since I started down this path. So
amazing. Well, what about your personal life, man? What does the future look like for you, Matt?
Personally, I'm hoping to be semi-retired, having a regenerative farm, and hopefully having a family with some kids, and just kind of hanging out. I think that's the long-term goal. Like I said before, I've been very fast-moving human professionally. Indeed. So I think personally the goal is that there's much less professional in me in 10 years. Gotcha. It'll always be part of me. Like, my friends always joke with me that there's no way I'll ever retire because I'm not that kind of human. But yeah, I see myself in the future doing a mixture of, teaching, like whether it be at a university or whatever, doing some consulting, because I do really love the consulting space, but also just making time to be in nature and, be that outdoor enthusiast, be that that person that has allowed me to find this professional career in the first place.
I love that, man. I have no doubt that you will get that in both personal and professional ways, man. So, Matt, I want to take this time to appreciate you for what you do, both as a person. You have always been a super kind and good person to be around, but also professionally, what you do really does help move the needle in this climate crisis that we're in. And every time I talk to you, I always learn something new. So for that, man, I appreciate you, and I thank you again for taking the time to speak with us today.
Yeah, I appreciate you too. Thank you so much, and thanks for having me. I know we'll talk again soon.
We will, man. Thanks, man.
Thanks.